Okay, peace in, y'all.
Peace in.
And everybody.
That was rude.
All right, the question you're asking yourself as we go through this continues to be, sets like, were these good guys or bad guys? Were they captains of industry? Like, hey, that sounds kind of positive. Or were they robber barons? Or, as we learned with Andrew Carnegie especially, like, there was a little bit of a dilemma there in our minds about the moral issue with Andrew Carnegie, because he grew up as a rags to riches story. He had always wanted to help others, right? He grew this empire, and then we learned about that strike, and that made us think, well, maybe he wasn't a good guy because he's paying his workers that little money, and they're working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we might have had like this judgment in our minds, like, well, maybe he wasn't such a good guy. Maybe he really is a robber baron and making all this money, taking advantage of other people. And then we find out that at the end of his life, he got $300 million personally from the $480 million buyout, and he gave 90% of it away to people he didn't even know. So what was he?
He's my hero.
And if we say he was taking advantage of other people, what are we comparing him to? Jesus? Or are we comparing him to all the other companies that, do you think it was like this? Andrew Carnegie, that mean old man, he was paying his people that much money while the guy down the street was paying him much more. Do you think that's the way it was happening? Come on, use logic. No, because they would have just gone and worked for that guy, right? Unfortunately, that's the way of it. Jaden and I like to think that if we were living in 1854 Georgia, that we would have been so against slavery, we would have risked our lives to free all those slaves, and would we? Or was it such a way of life that we would have just gone along to get along? So by bringing up the Homestead strike and that just shows how Carnegie really was. He chose, do you notice in the video? He chose power and wealth over the good of the working man. What standard are you holding him to? Your lofty standard or the standard of the day? Again, I ask. We'd all raise our hands and say, absolutely. If I was living back then, I would have been against slavery. I would have been telling everybody against slavery. I would have been risking my life to free the slaves, really. Did we start talking about Rockefeller yet? I think we did. You guys are ahead of them because they were in class yesterday.
Yeah.
Tell me where, did we get all the way through Rockefeller? All right. So you had Vanderbilt, the railroads. You had Carnegie with the steel. Steel, very important to our area. I think I mentioned yesterday how Youngstown was once the happening place. You had Pittsburgh, you had Cleveland in between, you had Youngstown. This was called the Steel Belt. The economy was humming. You had, I should look this up. The height of Youngstown's population, I don't know, but I know that well over half of them in a generation have left Youngstown because it went from the Steel Belt to the Rust Belt. In other words, that's the metaphor, that they use for our area now, because once we were thriving in steel, now the steel is all gone, and what happens after a period of time, oxidation, and the steel rusts. And now you drive through Youngstown, you see the remnants of all of those old steel mills and those buildings with the windows out and graffiti all over them. It kind of makes you really sad to think of what once was in our area, that thriving steel industry where like my father didn't even graduate from high school, but ended up making a pretty good living, started off in the steel mills and ended up at Lordstown, General Motors, making pretty good money when life was like that. Like, had all those jobs and all that industry in this area. But we got to shake off the rust. See what I did there? And get back to work and rebuild, which they're trying to do. A lot of people have been trying to revitalize. It's a different era, right? We're technological era. There are still a lot of jobs. As a matter of fact, right now there's more jobs than people willing to work, right? So if we get that thing fixed, then the economy might start humming again, right? We would quit paying people to stay home instead of work, then the jobs would be filled, things would get much better. All right, we did say that the big thing you learn about Rockefeller for you future business students, which, again, I know I've said this before, you might think you got life all figured out. You might going to be the center fielder for the Cleveland Indians like I was going to be when I was your age. God's got other plans. 90% of you will have, 90% of you, if you stop and think right now, hey, what do you want to be when you grow up? The statistics say that 90% of you will not be doing that when you're 25 years old. Because that's just the way it is, right? Your interests are going to change. So for those of you out there that will be in business, because statistics also say that a handful of you at least will be in some kind of business, you'll get business education or be working as an entrepreneur, owner of a business. This trust that he set up, this was legal. Okay, he's a robber baron. He was just taking advantage of all the people that didn't have as much as he did. How did he build this trust? He kept accumulating wealth with wise investments. There's competition. Competition is what America's about, right? America was built on free market competition, companies vying for your dollar, you giving your dollar to the one that's going to give you the best quality at the lowest price, right? Rockefeller was doing that. And on the way, he was investing in other companies that were successful, and he kept accumulating wealth. What did he do with it? He would see a competitor. Oh no, this is where it gets a little dicey. It's all about competition. Well, he would see a competitor and say, well, I don't want competition because I want to be the owner of everything. So he would, what does that mean? Do you understand what it means to buy out a company? This is an economics class, and I'm not an expert in it. Let me say that at the beginning. I mean, I took college. I'm able, I got a certificate to teach it, but I'm not like JP Morgan, right? So, but here's the gist of it. If I start buying shares in Jaden's company, and then I buy more shares, and then I buy more shares, and I keep accumulating wealth, and I buy more shares. What happens when I have 51% of the shares of her company? Guess who controls her company? I do. So he was able to set up this legal thing. It was legal at the time, where he's able to buy up all these companies, and he got his company and 27 others that just operate under one legal corporate entity. And the people that were being bought up, they didn't want to, like we talked about Ray Kroc and McDonald's, right? They didn't necessarily want to be bought out, but guess what? That power and money that just kept moving along. He kept accruing all these things. And the people, 11 years later, were like, we got to put a stop to this. I mean, America's about competition, right? Free market. What happens when someone takes advantage of the competition and they create a, what's it called, starts with an M? Monopoly. Is that good for American commerce? Yeah.
If people want to buy companies' shareholder things, does the company have to give them, like, say, yeah, you can buy that, or they can just buy whatever they want?
Well, I'm not positive about all the legalities. However, if you're a company and people are buying your stocks, you're happy because your stock price keeps going up, right? So
Yeah, but
that's a good question, though. Right? Yes. I'm gonna lean towards there are ways a company can stop it. But I'm telling you factually that I don't know. Do you understand what she's saying? Like if nowadays, before this, for the antitrust laws, are there legal mechanisms in place that if David's company, if he sees somebody out there like keeps buying up his shares, they're like, no, is there a legal way for him to stop that? You understand the question? I'm leaning towards there is. And then they go to court. Yeah. Yeah. All right, so the country says, whoa, pump the brakes here. Because other people in other industries started to see what Rockefeller was doing and said, hey, great idea. Wouldn't everybody want to corner the market? You ever play Monopoly? Right? You go around each corner. You want to get all the properties around the corner. You keep building up to corner the market. You want a monopoly. What's the goal of monopoly? To own everything, bankrupt everybody else. that's kind of the American dream, right? To be able to, listen, the sky's the limit, you're a business, soar as high as you can soar. However, what else is the American dream? That you be able to freely compete in the market, right? So at what point does the freedom that allows him to build up all this wealth, which most Americans, I think even still today, as crazy as today seems, I think most Americans would agree that we don't want to limit people's ability to achieve and be successful. But then, at what point does the individual's ability to achieve start to encroach on everybody's ability to achieve? Because if you keep playing this game, the whole country would be run by 5 people. Some people. That's not the story. I know it's 7. Anyway, everybody get everything going on here about Rockefeller? Oh, this is what you want to see. Does that mean he doesn't like me?
Yes. Well, you're trash. What the heck?
Thanks, Barbie.
Trash Barbie. Maybe she's going to
That's true.
I want the world to know, got to let it show.
That's big guy money.
No, seriously, more than ever, like always, try to put it on freeze, because you never know what's gonna pop up on your computer. But you can't literally allow any ad to come on your TV. And it almost makes me want to cry, because your generation is being so indoctrinated into this perverse culture that you can't escape it. That commercial right there, I'm almost guaranteed if I let it run, there will be some perverse thing on there trying to promote and sexualize your generation into thinking that perversity is A-okay. Makes me sick. Gotta be more careful than ever. You can't let anything in. Yes. Yes. Again, question. Captain of industry, great guy. Think of all the people he employed. Think of all the people that have dinner on their table because this guy was giving them a job, or Robert did it, robbing other people.
The world has ever seen. But he was also notoriously ruthless. And many believe he went too far. For John D. Rockefeller, Judgment Day is here, in what's become the trial of the century. The people versus Standard Oil.
The picture painted of Standard Oil is a depressing one. No trust in the history of America has been so destructive in its pursuit of profit. Time and time again, we have heard how Standard Oil has used secret kickbacks from the railroads, been routinely engaged in predatory pricing, used intimidation and exclusive sales territories to put refineries out of business. For over 30 years, Standard Oil has been on a mission to crush its competition and establish itself as a monopoly to hoist up the price of kerosene. Mr. Rockefeller, before the court renders its decision, do you have anything you wish to say?
Sounds like a robber baron, doesn't it? I mean, think about it. If you have a monopoly, not only did you buy out all those other companies, but you control the price, right? Less competition means higher prices for everybody. Why are there, when you see one gas station on one corner, why is there another gas station right across the street? Why are all the fast food places all kind of centralized in one location? You would think they'd be like, oh, I don't want to be there because that means I have to compete against the other restaurant. We actually like that. we as consumers like the fact that they're all together, gives us more choice and keeps the price down, because especially people like me, I'm gonna go to the place where if the food's similar, if it's not really great, much greater than the other place, I'm gonna go to a place that's cheaper, right? But then on the other hand, the businesses, it kind of works for them too, because it draws all people to that place, and then they'll choose to go to their establishment, right? But what if it's just one company? That's no good really for anybody. Well, what's his defense?
When I came into the oil industry, there was chaos. I brought order. I took a second-rate, inefficient market and built an industry. It was done the way it was because that's the way it had to be done.
If people need oil, did he make sure it was provided to everybody?
No one complained when I brought light into every home. No one complained when I provided thousands of jobs or millions of dollars from exports. Oil is what this country runs on. You call it monopoly. I call it enterprise. Now, you tell me, why am I here?
Good or bad? Is he right? Hey, by the late 1800s, there were, people had enough kerosene to fuel their, you've seen the old pictures of the lamps, the oil lamps, and were fueled by kerosene, so they could be running like all day. You just have the kerosene in the lamp. There would be pipes sending it up to into your rooms that would allow you to, before electricity. He's saying, how do you think that happened? That happened because of all the work I did to make sure that that happened in everybody's home. And I'm sitting here like I'm the bad guy. So, anybody got comments? I hope that you're actually wrestling with it, struggling with it. Like, man, is this a good guy or a bad guy? Maybe both or neither. Well, you could be whatever. Yeah, I'm saying. It's you gotta think about it. Same with Carnegie. Gave away all his money to charity. People didn't even know. But if people were working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, they were getting by. Was he? What if you were working? What if you were working in that filthy environment for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week? Would you think he was a generous guy? You barely had enough to put food on the table for your family?
Yeah, but you're working.
Where else are you gonna go?
So be happy with your job. Go get a better job.
Yeah.
Also, the people who work the steel thing, they didn't have to like go to college for it or like actually, like get a higher education or work there. So it's just kind of like something you do. So it doesn't have to be paid as much as like a doctor.
Listen, in my father's generation, your grandparents' generation, college was a more elite thing. It wasn't like today, you're growing up in a generation and started in mine, that like everybody's expected to go to college. That wasn't always the case. Some of you know your grandparents' story. Like my dad didn't graduate from high school and ended up having making a pretty decent living, starting in the steel mills and then working at General Motors on the assembly line. And wow, he ended up, by the time he was done, they were making really good money. He didn't graduate high school. People would go right from high school or before they were done with high school, right into the steel mills and made a decent living. This is 50s, 60s, not 1890s and early 1900s. Yeah.
I don't know if this is like a dumb question or.
There is no such thing as a stupid question.
But like, I know, like you said, like he also has to pay the shareholders, so he can pay like the others.
Right.
More.
but like, it said the conditions were like bad, like,
Yeah.
then maybe some of the extra money to like make the conditions better.
Right. And that's gonna be the theme of the late 1890s into the early 1900s, which, and again, I could talk about this stuff for hours, but if you've ever heard of the word progressive, like if you're old enough now and you've been following politics and you know the conservatives, liberals, and sometimes they call liberals progressives, well, the whole progressive movement started perhaps out of good intentions, like, hey, what's going on with the people like Rockefeller and the people that are the common labor people that are being taken advantage of, including, what did we learn about Carnegie? When did he go to work? What age, remember? 12. He was going to work at 12 and working like full time. Shouldn't there be a law against that? Right? But there wasn't yet. So there was a movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s to fix all that. Like, what are we doing here? You got children working 40 plus hours a week. And of course, we don't have to pay them much. They're just kids, right? They're just kind of supplemental income to their parents who are already making very little. How are we going to fix this? Part of the antitrust actions and trying to make things more equitable for everybody. And then you get the rise of unions. What was the purpose of unions in the beginning? To make sure that the workers had a voice for them, that they would be able to collectively bargain with the owners. And in some people's mind, what happened was, over time, where they started off with seemingly good intentions, then the unions became too powerful. Speaking of the steel mills, how about this for a powerful union? So I talked yesterday about how China, gentlemen, how China kind of led to the demise of the steel industry, but guess what? Those unions that had that good intention of making sure the working conditions were better for the workers and making sure their pay was a decent pay to be able to afford to feed their families, they became so powerful that if you were the owner of a company, you had to deal with things like this. And this is something I heard as a young person growing up. My grandfather and a lot of my uncles and my family in Youngstown, of course, worked in steel. How about they got to the point where they were getting 13 weeks of vacation every year. Instead of one day off, now 13 weeks. The company owner was expected to give every worker 13 weeks of vacation. So again, nothing's black and white. You know, when you're young, and too many old people think that there's like, it's either this or that. A whole lot of gray in the middle, right? Like, there's a whole lot that goes into every political decision, everything that involves people and relationships. It's not just black and white, good and bad. There's a whole bunch in the middle. So it leads me to thinking when I give that speech in algebra, why do we have to do this? We're never going to use it in real life. And I always give the same speech. You're learning to be problem solvers. And if you're growing up, especially now, the things that seem like there's so much trouble in the world, who's going to solve them? Or are we just going to give up? You can solve them. So you might not ever use algebra, but by learning different strategies to solve problems, believe it or not, I'm not just saying it like a teacher talk, like you build up that repertoire of intelligence and being able to work through problems, we can fix the world. Does that make sense? So who was complaining when everybody had lights in the house? No one. That's Rockefeller. Yes. You all right?
No, Isaac did.
Okay. Did you vote Johnny Cash today? Is that why I got confused?
We're still doing notes.
Yep. Come on, Jake.
But
There's one chief, and guess who it's not?
But we're ahead of the other.
Jake, remember that? There's one chief, and guess who it's not?
Oh, I do.
What's going on?
She's telling us not to do that.
What's that?
It's divine providence not to be nuts.
Oh, wait, there's more. You guys know that guy, right? Who knows JP Morgan? I know. Wait, you don't know JP Morgan? Integrity is everything. No, that's not him, Gary. Come on. Will's dad is not 150 years old. So we got Vanderbilt with the railroads, Carnegie with the steel, Rockefeller with the oil, and now you got this guy who really isn't dealing in a product, a material. He's dealing in cash. He's dealing in the results of all of this wealth. He's a financier, or the video calls him a financier. He's a financier that is able to himself accumulate wealth. His money grow. His money earns more money. Not his labor or his selling of products, selling his ideas, using his investment acumen builds money. That's the whole point of investments, right? Whole point to investments is your money makes money while you sleep. Isn't that a great idea? Anybody think that's a bad thing? You invest because your money makes money. Yeah, go ahead. You can write on the board over there. Okay. He bought out Carnegie Steel. We already learned about that, but we didn't tell you the price of it. We told you that Carnegie himself got $300 million, but the price of the buyout was $480 million. By the way, somebody in the second period did the calculations that someone can transfer what the value of that was. The 300 million is 9 billion. So the 480 million would be what? Something about 30 times that. What would that be? $12 billion. Over $12 billion that would have been to be paid for a company in today's dollar. For one company. He bought out interest in many of the smaller railroads and merged those together. By buying Carnegie Steel and a bunch of other smaller steel companies, he creates a business called U.S. Steel. Take a tour of Youngstown, you'd see U.S. Steel all over the place. Again, captain of industry or robber baron. Much of your grandparents and my family benefited from the steel industry in Youngstown. I say benefited, they might say, I hate this job. Always, of course, workers are always going to think they make too little money. That's another factor, right? Oh, not another video.
Save it for tomorrow.
JP Morgan, like you've never seen him before. By the way, what's John's middle name is Hall. The original JP Morgan is Pierpont or Pierpont. John Pierpont.
Hulu Ad Manager is the easy way for businesses like yours to advertise on Hulu. JP Morgan is the largest bank in the Western world, with assets worth an estimated $3.2 trillion. So big is this bank that if it were to collapse, it might well take the global economy with it. Its prestige and political influence are unrivaled, and in truth, it's one of the most powerful institutions on earth. But JP Morgan was not always so rich or powerful. Its origin goes back 2 centuries to a very strange man. This is the story of that man, and of a financial empire that continues to grow even now. John Pierpont Morgan was born in Connecticut in 1837. By that time, the Morgan family were already influential, his father co-founding a banking firm. As a young man, John worked for that firm, learning about finance and the banking industry. He also showed a natural shrewdness, coming up with all kinds of schemes to make money. At one point, he purchased 5,000 surplus rifles from the government. They only cost him $3.50 each, but would later be sold back to the government for $22 each, giving Morgan a massive profit. It was just one of the many scandalous deals that made him rich.
Somebody said scandalous. Who said that? Does that sound scandalous?
Seems smart.
Did anybody out there think when they first heard that story that he bought all these rifles for $3.50 and then sold them for 22? Is that a scandal?
That's passive income. It's about.
It's what?
That's passive income. It's just buying.
He bought them from the government for $3.50 each, and then later the government needed munitions, so he sold them back to the government for $22 each. And it's considered scandalous. Honestly, is it? Listen, somebody have the other point of view. Do you think it's scandalous? Do you think it's like, that's not right? What's that?
They sold them to in the first place, so.
Right.
Can they change their
So
mind?
that was an interesting word they chose, scandalous. Like, how is that a scandal?
With the profits, he bought a railroad in New York, realizing that by owning parts of America's physical infrastructure, he would directly profit from industrialization. Using funds from his father's banking firm, he built a railroad empire stretching across the continent.
Do you think he should be that rich, Sydney, while these men are out there in the freezing, shoveling snow off the railroad tracks? Is that fair?
It depends.
But it's not common.
Yeah.
I think it's fair.
How's it fair?
He worked to get to that place.
Well,
He was smart and
if you remember, this guy was kind of born into a banking. He wasn't the rags to riches story that Carnegie was.
still had to work. He had to be smart. He had
Mhm.
probably smart with a lot of it.
These guys look like they're working pretty hard. It's freezing. Wind chill's probably what? Wait, most -10 wind chill. Yeah.
If he wasn't that rich, those guys wouldn't have jobs at all.
Mm.
Yeah, for real.
Well, maybe you'd rather not have a job at all than have to work like that.
And quit.
Yeah, find a different job.
Smart. Yes.
As railroads were the biggest business on earth at the time, he became savagely wealthy, and all this
Savagely wealthy.
They don't like him.
Scandalous. Anyway, is it your class that learns? I think they said Mrs. Martin does this all the time. They're learning about bias and all that.
We did
Are
that
you
last year.
catch these words?
Yeah.
Scandalous, savagely wealthy.
Mm.
Where do you think this is leaning, left or right? Any, you know politics.
before he took over his father's bank. That happened in 1890, by which time it was among the most successful on Wall Street. He renamed it J.P. Morgan and Company because he was very humble and got to work financing great industrialists. He funded Thomas Edison in establishing General Electric. He bought out the Carnegie Steel Empire for $1 billion, which in those days had never before been done, making it the first billion-dollar company. He also helped put together AT&T and many other corporate giants. As an investment bank, J.P. Morgan owned a piece of each. By by gathering various smaller companies into single dominant monopolies. Morgan's influence in business soon outgrew that of the president. He was so powerful, people saw him as being behind everything. When the Titanic sank in 1912, J.P. Morgan was accused of being responsible, deliberately causing the disaster for an insurance payout. By the time of his death, Morgan owned 1/3 of America's railways, but his true legacy would be the bank. After the death of J.P. Morgan was taken over by his son, J.P. Morgan. Morgan Jr. focused heavily on Europe. During World War I, J.P. Morgan was the sole bank to underwrite war bonds to the UK and France. The total sum of those bonds was around $1.5 billion.
So was he responsible for World War I because he was selling war bonds?
Yeah. 100%.
Did you catch the, some of you were paying attention? I didn't want to stop again because the video, the time will be up before the video's over, but the sarcastic, because he was so humble, he called him J.P. Morgan. Scandalous, savagely, and because he was so humble, he called him J.P. Morgan. And now, he's responsible for the Titanic.
No.
I forget too.
You see why they call him Robert Burns. Depends on your perspective.
Shut up.
He made sure it was, I say, Andrew. Oh, yeah.
Rose and Jack were simping for each other while the ship was sinking.
Jack saves Rose
Don't
life.
touch.
You're not the same one.
What?
You're not the same one anymore.
No, the contract got expired.
I got.
You got cut off.
Wow.
How bad? Pretty bad.
Bridges were burnt.
This is a great video.
David, is it that you don't care about the working
Right now, I
class?
don't know.
We all go through it, but never do that again. Everyone will like it.
You never do what again?
Huh? He flipping hates me. Your mom. Yep.
What the heck, Jake?
Look at Derek. Fine line between love and hate.